Welcome everyone. Glad you could come. This is a holiday bonus episode of the Classic English Literature Subcast. Here in the US of A, it's Thanksgiving Day, that most American of holidays in which gluttony masquerades as gratitude. It's what we do. Now, since in the mainline episodes we've been in the first half of the 1600s, I figured today is a good day to talk about that first Thanksgiving at Plymouth in 1621, in which the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag feasted the success of the harvest. But first, let's clear up a couple of things. That 1621 knees up in Plymouth was not, in any strict way, the first Thanksgiving. No, I'm sorry. The indigenous peoples had celebrated harvest festivals since the year dot. The Green Corn Festival of the Iroquois, to take but one example, heralded the ripening of staple crops. In the Virginia colony, the Jamestown settlers held a Thanksgiving service in 1607 for their safe arrival. And 3 years later, in 1610, they had another Thanksgiving, which marked the arrival of supply ships after the so-called starving time, when almost 90% of the population perished. Also, on December 4th, 1619, settlers at the Berkeley Hundred Plantation, led by Captain John Woodleaf, arrived in Virginia. Now, as instructed by their sponsors in England, they held a Thanksgiving service upon arrival, declaring, quote, "We ordain that the day of our ship's arrival shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God." I have never celebrated Thanksgiving on December 4th. Have you? Maybe in other places. But anyway, we got a bunch here, and I won't even get into the Spanish and French celebrations that were in Florida and Texas and Canada. So, yes, the first Thanksgiving was not the first Thanksgiving. Myth busted. So why has the Pilgrim Feast so captured the cultural imagination? I think it's because this is the story that fits American mythology best. And I don't mean myth here as lie. I'm not being pejorative. I mean myth in the literary and anthropological sense, as in a story that speaks to the values and the identity of a people, a culture. And more than Virginia or Canada, the Plymouth story grows to become the Genesis story of America. But it didn't start out that way, of course. People looking to get the real story of Thanksgiving go to the most obvious source, and that's William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. It was written between 1630 and 1651, over those 2 decades, and it chronicles the Pilgrims' time in England, their persecution for religious dissent under King Jamie, first of his name, and their decision to leave for the Netherlands. It further details their years in Leiden, their shock at the permissive tolerance of Dutch society, and their eventual decision to seek freedom and opportunity in the New World. It describes the voyage of the Mayflower, the signing of the Mayflower Compact, and the Pilgrims' arrival at Cape Cod in November 1620. It tells of the challenges of the first winter, where nearly half the colonists died, and the assistance they received from the Wampanoag peoples, including Squanto, who played a vital role in teaching them survival skills. We talked about some of this in our 4th of July episode on the English language coming to America. But, faithful listener, you'll be disappointed, I'm sure, by Governor Bradford's relation of the origins of this great American feast. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to know that he even mentions it. I'm going to give you the entire description of Thanksgiving as related by Governor William Bradford of the Plymouth colony. Here it is. "They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter, being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all things in good plenty. For as some were thus employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was great store of wild turkeys, of which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to that proportion, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not famed but true reports. Yeah, that's it. Right? No talk of feasting, no talk of games or camaraderie with the Wampanoag people, no mention of parades or football games or Uncle Ted being deep into his second bottle of Baileys. Just, we got a bunch of food together, as you already know. Since this is a podcast about English literature, I feel obligated to point out that Bradford's writing in this passage, and indeed in the entire book, is a prime example of what is now called the Puritan Plain Style. The Puritan Plain Style. Bradford scrupulously avoids excessive ornamentation in his writing, focusing instead on factual and straightforward accounts of direct experiences. The sentences are syntactically simple, with a dearth of rhetorical flourish, and references to everyday events and objects replace the elaborate metaphors and conceits that we would find in Francis Bacon or John Donne. And of course, classical allusion, seen as dangerously pagan, has no place in the plain style. Glorifying God and his providence is Bradford's primary intent, not to showcase his own literary dexterity. This plain style will be a hallmark of English Puritan literature in both the Old and the New Englands. Okay, so where did the idea of the big feast come from? Yeah, where do we get that fairy story of cultural exchange and amity? Well, that comes from a little pamphlet called Mort's Relation, which was published in 1621. It's written mostly by Edward Winslow, and he was a prominent leader of the Pilgrim community, though many think that Bradford may have had his hand in the writing of some of it. The title, Mort's Relation, comes from the fact that it was mistakenly published under the name George Morton, or Mort, who, though a separatist with the Pilgrims in Holland, he did not travel with them to New England right away. He only came over in 1623. So somehow it was thought that he'd written the booklet and it just stuck. Anyway, it's this little pamphlet that gives us a more familiar image of the Thanksgiving legend. Quote, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after a special manner rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl, as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week, at which time amongst other recreations we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king Massasoit, with some 90 men, who for 3 days we entertained and feasted, and they went out and killed 5 deer which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." That sounds more like it, huh? Yeah, now we're cooking. I think I came across something suggesting that swan was on the menu that day. Swan, that's a bit posh, isn't it? I mean, hardly anyone can afford swan nowadays. I think the king only eats it now on Guy Fawkes Day, flame-broiled, I'm informed by reliable sources. Anyway, very direct, unadorned prose so as not to obscure the message of God's bounty to the community. Plain style. We can see the plain style at work in Puritan religious verse as well. 20 years after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, the first book was printed in what is now the United States. Officially called The Whole Book of Psalms Faithfully Translated into English Meter, the Bay Psalm book rendered English translations of the Hebrew into a meter suitable for singing during worship services. Other psalters existed, of course, but Puritans found the translations troublesome theologically, so scholars such as Richard Mather and John Eliot, they undertook this new metrical rendering published by Stephen Day, Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1640. And it was a quarto edition of 148 leaves with a print run of 1,700 copies. The Psalms are set in what's called common meter, which are alternating lines of 8 and 6 syllables. Now, since we're here on Thanksgiving today, let's have a look at Psalm 107. First, from the Geneva Bible translation in prose. I'll just read the first handful of verses. Quote, "Praise the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. Let them which have been redeemed of the Lord show how he hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor, and gathered them out of the lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. When they wandered in the desert and wilderness out of the way, and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted in them. Then they cried unto the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress, and led them forth by the right way, that they might go to a city of habitation." As you can hear, the Geneva Bible really sets the template for this plain style adopted by English Puritans. Trouble is, you really can't sing it. The melodies used for singing the Psalms varied from congregation to congregation, but there were several common tunes that they used kind of interchangeably. A tune like Southwell or Dundee would have been pretty typical. I've got here a little organ sample of the melody St. Anne, which also works well for common meter singing, such as Psalm 107 requires. Here's a little listen. So these tunes are simple, repetitive, and meant to be sung a cappella by a congregation. So, with Psalm 107, that prose from the Geneva Bible, which is so unsingable, becomes this. Quote, "O give ye thanks unto the Lord, because that good is he, because his loving kindness lasts to perpetuity. So let the Lord's redeemed say whom he freed from the enemy's hands, and gathered them from east and west, from south and northern lands. In the desert, in a desert way they wandered, no town fine to dwell in, hungry and thirsty their soul within them pined. Then did they to Jehovah cry when they were in distress, who did them set at liberty out of their anguishes. In such a way that was most right he led them forth also, that to a city which they might inhabit they might go." Okay, yeah, I don't know about you, but I find this rendering kind of metrically tortured. The meter never seems quite right. It's kind of difficult to regularize in a poetic fashion. Feels like sometimes the beat falls on the wrong word. Yeah, you sure can't dance to it, which is probably what the Puritans wished to avoid. And the rhymes are a bit forced in places, no? Distress and anguishes? That feels like a reach. But nonetheless, the Bay Psalm book was one of the great literary achievements of early English in America. And though none of its translations are used in worship services today, it was very influential well into the 18th century. By the by, if you care, Psalm 107 also contains one of my favorite lines in all the Psalms. Now, from the Geneva again, verses 23 and 24, quote, "They that go down to the sea in ships and occupy by the great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep." See, I grew up in Rhode Island, and I spent a fair amount of my childhood on the New England coast. There's something for me so evocative and elemental about those lines, so primal. If you go to Gloucester, Massachusetts, a bit north of Rhode Island, and it's quite a significant fishing port, there's a famous bronze statue overlooking the sea of the Gloucester fisherman, and the statue is called the Man at the Wheel. And it's a rugged fisherman, and he stands resolutely at the helm of his vessel, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, determined, courageous, constantly challenging the unpredictable deep. His oilskins and rain-slicked hat shield him from the relentless wind and spray as his weathered hands grip the ship's wheel with a mix of strength and finesse, as though steering not just the ship, but actually the fate of those who depend on him while he braves the crashing waves out of Gloucester Harbor. And on the base of that memorial, those words from the psalm are carved, those spare, plain words as taciturn as the sailor's face. I just love that. And I think maybe when those English Puritans in their meeting houses 400 years ago sang these lines, "They that go down to the sea in ships that trade therein, these men within the deep waters Jehovah's work have seen." Perhaps their memories of their passages years ago on the Mayflower or the Arbella lingered in their thanks to God for his guardianship and preservation against the travails of the wild world. Great. So, I know we note in all these texts the overriding theme of God's divine providence, the belief that English Puritans in the so-called New World were the agents of the Almighty's cosmic plan for the redemption of fallen humanity. We talked about that city upon a hill trope from John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity and its resonance throughout American history on that July 4th episode I mentioned earlier. All of that obtains here. And this is why I think that we in America envisage the Pilgrims feast with the Wampanoag as the first Thanksgiving, despite the fact that we've had many earlier documented celebrations. Because we think of the Pilgrims as idealistic sojourners, believers in individual conscience, anti-monarchist, independent and principled. They are the earliest avatars of what we now think of as the American spirit, in ways that the Virginians or the Canadians were just not at the time. These latter were purely business ventures. But, though the bulk of the people actually who settled at Plymouth were there only for the filthy lucre as well, we still think of the Pilgrim settlement as one of higher ideals, the birth of a new world. Those early interactions with the native peoples do seem to promise harmony and comedy and good faith dealing. Tragically, though, we know how that story ends. Centuries of war, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal began mere years after that halcyon meal by the shores of Massachusetts Bay. If the Cape Cod Thanksgiving is America's genesis, the myth of its creation in a fruitful wilderness, the serpent lurks in the trees. But perhaps, for a moment, a fleeting, tiny, wisp-like moment, there was a glimpse of the possible peaceable kingdom promised by that prophet Isaiah. So maybe today we should be thankful for its existence and strive to regain that moment. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone, everywhere.